The format is that I say hello, and these two do the talking. And I thought that we might perhaps, this is billed as a session on Kosovo, but I thought perhaps we might start by picking up the discussion that we had earlier in the day, in the afternoon, and actually go right back to the beginning of the breakup of Yugoslavia, in which Kosovo itself plays a not insignificant part. But maybe I could ask President Tadič to start by, who lived through all of this, to tell us why it happened and how it looked to an insider, and then Carl Bildt, who perhaps of all of the Europeans has most personal involvement in this part of the world, to tell us his story as well.
Well, the former Yugoslavia, Serbia itself, is facing with a political crisis more than 2 decades. I was always thinking that political crisis, every crisis is a real opportunity to strengthen your own capacities and to be more capable to deliver better results and to provide better conditions for your own people. Now Europe is facing with that kind of problem and with that kind of challenge, and I hope that Europe is going to strengthen capacities and institutional performances rather than to make them weaker. And I think that at the same time Europe has to keep that part of enlargement vitally important. Otherwise, I see that Europe will be in a very difficult situation in the near future. And also, when I'm saying this, I'm always taking into consideration a wider perspective, whether Europe is going to be capable to compete with other global powers in the next 2 decades. Having in mind that perspective, I was always thinking that the former Yugoslav countries are belonging, culturally speaking, politically speaking, economically, in terms of security, to European Union. I don't see the alternative to that political process. Even though Europe is not the structure of that good performances, it was only a few years ago. But having all those things into the consideration, we were facing with the very serious problems in terms of this forming from Yugoslavia and trying to solve the consequences of that horrible war, and also on the Kosovo issue, which was one of the most sensitive issues for Serbian politicians for decades. As I said, you cannot be good European but a bad neighbor. What was our commitment to that system of values and political philosophy? That was a process of reconciliation.
But can I ask you a question first, and that is, were you surprised by the war?
By war?
By the outbreak of violence? Because in the Foreign Office, when we saw trouble starting in Yugoslavia, I gathered together every diplomat I could find who'd served in Belgrade and had a kind of open session and asked them what they expected. And nobody thought there was going to be the kind of violence that took place.
Oh, well, in that time, I wasn't a politician. I was professor of psychology. And I talked with my friend Croat, who has been living next to my home in Belgrade. And he said to me, a war is coming. That was the end of 1980s. I was surprised about his analysis by saying, well, come on, what are you talking about? He said, a war is coming overnight. Now he's living in Milano, in Italy, with his wife from Belgrade, He is not planning to turn back, nor in Serbia, neither in Croatia. And that is a consequence of the war. We've been growing up next to each other for decades, playing soccer. He was more talented than I. But whenever I've been facing with some political challenges, we made a full conversation, and he sent to me some suggestions what to do. In that time, he couldn't imagine that I'm going to become a president of Serbia. But that happened. That is how I'm explaining to you situation in my country just before war came.
Carl, how did it seem to you?
Well, it seems to me chillingly familiar. It reminds me of when I was asked in the past by people, is there a book I could read to understand that part of the world? Which was somewhat politically incorrect at the time. I always recommended Ivo Andrić. Read The Bridge over the Drina, and you get the most of the story. And what the president just told me reminded me of another small essay by Ivo Andrić. I think it's called The Letter from Sarajevo.
Yes.
Which are two old school friends who meet at the train station of Slavonski Brod, I think in 1920 or whatever, something like that, and tell stories roughly like this. Roughly like this. So the Balkans, it's a small place. I mean, in population, 4% at the most of Europe. In terms of economy, I think, if I'm optimistic, 0.5%. So not much consequence from that point of view. But it does have that ability to create problems, both for itself and for the rest of us. 100 years ago was 1913. The First Balkan War had barely ended. Mobilization for the Second Balkan War was going on. And we were on the verge, started really on the 1st of August 1914, but 28th of June, Sarajevo, murders, Franz Ferdinand. The Third Balkan War turned into the First World War. The lights went out all over Europe. And I would argue they didn't really come on in all of Europe until, say, 1991 or something like that. And what happened then, when we started to see a Europe coming to, because up until 1914, that was the glory of Europe. It was a more or less united multinational Europe. It was dominating the world. Then came the great catastrophe. It started there. 91, 89 or whatever, we could start again in all of Europe. Great success stories. Unification of Germany, 3 Baltic states coming back. But then again, catastrophe in the Balkans. 10 years of devastating war, started with small Slovenia, ending in sort of Macedonia in 2001, really. 10 years of devastating wars that we couldn't control. So why this? Yeah.
Well, why this?
Well, I would argue that you might say those guys down there, they are crazy. They like these things. Not the case. I mean, they're exactly like us. The drama that we've seen down there has been the latest version of the drama that we've seen all over Europe. The Ottoman Empire ruled there. It's been an area of Europe ruled by empires for a very long time. Ottoman Empire, Habsburg Empire, whatever. It left a mosaic of peoples and cultures more profound than anywhere else. And while in the rest of Europe, we spent a couple of 100 years of de facto ethnic cleansing all over the place. It came late to the Balkans, and we were unprepared for it. And then we were naive. We didn't think it could happen again in the way it had happened over Alsace-Lorraine, to take us one example, or we've had our share of fighting up here in Northern Europe as well. The bloodlands between Germany and Russia, if you read Timothy Snyder's book, all over. We were naive and didn't think it could happen again. It could happen again. It could happen again somewhere else if we are not careful. So it was a question of then us not being sufficiently aware of the need for the structures necessary to handle these different challenges of different identities and different cultures and different nations living together. And that, I think, is for me sort of the enduring lesson of the decades of Balkan tragedies that we faced first in the first decade of the last century and then in the second, or the last decade of the last century. And that is really the lesson that we must never forget from that part of history.
And in a second, I'll turn to Kosovo, because in a way it's precisely that
small place
that we, in the broad sense, because that includes the EU and it includes Serbia and it includes Pristina as well. That's what we've been trying to do, to create those structures. But can I just ask one question of Boris Tadič, and that is, I think that if you ask most people who know anything at all about it in the West, why did these wars take place? A large number of people probably even forgotten them by now in our countries. But I think a lot of people, if you ask them and they know something, they will say it was Slobodan Milosevic. Do you think that's reasonable?
The answer is not that simple.
Yeah, that's always the case.
The Kosovo conflict is also not that simple conflict. It's coming from decades and decades ago. More than 100 years is existing, that conflict. In fact, the conflict is about fighting for living space between Serbs and Albanians. At the same time, Slobodan Milosevic has been using that conflict in order to promote himself as a new leader, a new communist leader, new type of communist leader at the end of 1980s. If you ask me about his approach to that issue, he failed. Not only because of his methodology and the way of thinking how to solve conflict, but also he avoided to become the first communist, so-called democratic leader, because he was pretty sure to win elections until the end of, on the end of the 1980s because of his own promotion on Kosovo. But he avoided that in order to install the new constitution in Serbia, and he failed. And he failed once again, and once again, and once again. Now, many people on the West are thinking everything happened because of Slobodan Milosevic. But this is not the truth. He has his own responsibility, historically thinking, but if I'm mentioning other leaders from the Balkans, they failed also. Tudjman, Izetbegovic, and Albanian leaders. I cannot say that Ibrahim Rugova failed. I mean, he was a different leader. Why I'm saying this? He didn't want war. He was totally committed to work on peaceful solution. And that is some difference I see between him, Ibrahim Rugova, and other leaders in the former Yugoslavia. But it doesn't mean that Albanians didn't have that type of leaders. Whoever had power on Kosovo made horrible mistakes, Serbs or Albanians. As a president of Serbia, I was loyal to reconciliation from the beginning of my term, apologizing to the others, being criticized because of that in my own country, creating better conditions in order to reconcile to each other, to create normal relations, economic communication, political circumstances, and to bring all of us, not only Serbia, closer to European Union. That was my strategy. Now I see that we are closer to European Union, but this does not depend only on us, whether we'll become finally member states, but also European Union itself that is facing with the critical problems right now. Okay, we are waiting. European Union is going to solve that problem with the single currency, role of central bank and economic challenges, and after that to become member state. This is a joke. This is not functioning. We have to work on all those things at the same time. And this is only way, from my point of view. If Europe is going, finally, what I would like to to share with you as idea. If Europe is going to stop to block enlargement process because of problem Europe is facing with today, finally Europe is going to pay extremely high price. That is what Carl Bildt has been trying to explain
Right. Well,
in the previous
perhaps Carl can explain
debate.
it now then.
Well, I don't know. I agree. Enlargement with the Western Balkans is not going to be easy because these are sort of difficult places. There's quite a number of reconciliation things that needs to be. These things take time. We have sort of complicated structures. Bosnia is a very complicated place. Reminds you of Belgium at times. Macedonia and even more
not that complicated.
Wow. No, but Belgium is properly occupied both by the EU and NATO. Macedonia is perhaps the sort of one of the more complex places, as a matter of fact, and there the potential conflict is more difficult, I would argue, than anything that we are likely to face in Bosnia for a couple of structural reasons, because we got the Greek Macedonian, we all know that one. Even more complicated if you go into the Bulgarian Macedonian thing, and there's been tendencies in that direction in the Bulgarian election campaign as well. The only way to handle this is, as I said, structures of integration to contain all of these tensions so that time can work out and achieve some sort of reconciliation. So difficult place, absolutely, and we are going to face a lot of sort of structural issues inside the European Union, accommodating sort of 7 or whatever new states there, but the alternative is distinctly worse in every single respect.
And we have not stopped because, as you said earlier, Croatia joins in a few
No, we haven't
days.
stopped. As a matter of fact, the accession process is ongoing. I mean, Croatia will enter. I sincerely hope that there will be a date for the start of accession negotiations for Serbia. We have Montenegro is in some sort of negotiations. When we start giving accession date or start for accession negotiation with Serbia, we'll start sort of a process for so-called SA agreement with Kosovo. I hope that we can sort of get the Bosnian leaders to act together so that they can cross some of the hurdles that we have created, by the way, but that's a secondary issue, and that we'd all could start to move Macedonia forward. Albania, the same sort of thing. But it requires concerted diplomatic efforts all the time. And there are still quite a number of difficult issues between the nations that can prevent it from happening. But this is one of the sort of ongoing tasks of European diplomacy. I mean, Cathy Ashton probably spends more time, and Stefan Füle, spends more time on this than on any other issue whatsoever. And this is really where Europe has a responsibility. It must be done.
My previous boss always used to say, we can fail in the Middle East, that's normal. If we fail in the Balkans, we're finished.
Well, it's normally the Americans. Well, it used to be the Brits and the French who failed in the Middle East. Nowadays, it's the Americans.
Everyone, especially the local people. But I'd like to come back to the question of Kosovo, because the agreement which has been reached, it's not the end of the story at all. All of these agreements are normally no more than a plateau that you start the next stage in. It's important for several reasons. One particularly important is I hope that this unlocks the door to Serbia starting negotiations, because the impact of that around the Balkans will be very big. But I wondered if Boris Tadič could tell us a little bit about, from his perspective, how this began, because it's enormously to his credit that he was the person who broke the ice in starting this process.
First of all, I'm welcoming agreement.
Yes.
The ruling parties delivered in Serbia with Hashim Tači on Kosovo issue. I have some concerns about implementation, especially because of some concrete details in that agreement, which is not totally precisely defined.
Yeah.
And the problem is always in the small chapters, and we have to be very focused on that details in order to avoid any misinterpretation. I hope that the Prime Minister of Serbia and the Prime Minister of Kosovo are going to solve that problems and that's misinterpretations. I don't know if today they delivered something. Maybe during our talks we already have some decisions. But I'm expecting to be very concrete on implementation. Otherwise, we can be blocked, even though we can reach data for accession talks. That is why I have some concerns about further development. I think that Serbia is deserving data for accession talks. Serbia deserved data for accession talks even earlier, from my point of view. But okay. What happened on Kosovo is also vitally important right now. But for me, it's very important to keep Serbia on that track. Accession talks are the key, so conditio sine qua non of reforming process. Reforming process is a way how we can change in terms of quality of living standard, quality of institutions, protection of minority rights, of the human rights, our country. That is why I think data for accession talks and starting dialogue with the European Union is a key element in our policy in the next few years. And from that reason, in order to prevent any problem, in order to avoid blocking Serbia on that negotiation process, I'm expecting the prime ministers are going to be very strict in defining what is agreement. What is agreement? That is how I see the situation.
The encouraging thing about this is that, first of all, so far, all of the things that were agreed, except maybe for one, in the first phase of the dialogue, are now implemented. So sometimes it's not as fast as you want, but actually implementation has followed.
The exception being?
The exception being the border management. That's it's not complete, but it's actually pretty good at the moment.
It's pretty good.
You have joint teams
surprisingly good.
who are actually actually collaborating much more closely than the design said they would.
Agree.
So far, the record on implementation is pretty good. There will be difficulties, but the other encouraging thing is that I know that the prime ministers have agreed that they will continue to meet from time to time, precisely because they know that there are some things that will need to be dealt with in the future, and probably they can deal with it. But Carl, what do you think about all of this?
No, I agree. Implementation will take quite some time. I mean, the crux of the matter is two things. You have the vast majority of Serbs sort of refuse to recognize Kosovo as an independent country. I think this will sort of disappear by time. My favorite story is the former foreign minister of Serbia, Vuk Draskovic. I remember when I was there once in Belgrade, he brought me into his room and we had a private conversation. And then he said, Carl, when I look at that television screen every evening and I'd look at the weather forecast, I want the Serb weather forecast to cover Kosovo. I don't care about anything else.
Not even the weather?
Well, not even the weather, no. Which was indicated to me, and he's sort of culture guy, it is an emotional thing. It's an emotional thing. Fairly few people in Serbia proper have even been to Kosovo, but it's an emotional thing. It will take its time. Secondly, you have, of course, the problem that you have, whatever the number, you have a Serb minority, primarily in northern Kosovo. They believe that they are born in Serbia, Yugoslavia. They've never asked to live in another country. They don't want to live in another country, but they don't want to move. Now, this is not the first time we've encountered this in European history. South Tyrol, you can go to Åland Islands, you can go to Northern Ireland, you can go to X numbers of different places. We have seen this. That takes a certain amount of time. To have leaders on both sides, to have structures, to handle it. Don't necessarily define everything too precisely. Allow some wiggle room for different expectations to be there for some time. And the end of the day, of course, it is up to the leadership of Kosovo to gain the acceptance and trust of all of its citizens. That's going to take its time. But eventually, if things are handled well with economic development and they feel security and their fears are subsiding and all of that, eventually it will happen. But again, it will not happen without the rest of us Europeans being there and helping along the way. That was the case with South Tyrol. That was the case with the Northern Ireland. That was the case with Åland Island. It's always required a broader framework.
You require a bigger context.
It requires the bigger context and the bigger engagement.
And actually, it's precisely that, because what you want to do, and this is a tiny little place, it's 40, 50, 60,000 people, nothing more than that. And somehow or other you need to open it out so they understand that there's a big world out there and they belong to that as well. It's not just this problem. But I wanted to come to the way the process began, because I don't know if this was intentional or not. I'm not sure if Vuk Jeremic is somewhere here either.
No, he's in New York.
Ah, right. I thought that it was actually quite a smart move by Serbia to take this case to the ICJ in terms of handling the reaction to the Declaration of Independence. It seemed to me that this gave you a perfect reason for saying to everybody, keep calm. We're taking the legal route. We're taking this to the ICJ. And first of all, I think that was a good expression of the values that you stood for, that is to say, internationality and international legality. And secondly, it was an extremely good way of calming people down and avoiding the calls for action. But tell me how it seemed to you.
Now
and then.
After what happened?
Well, both times. How did it seem at the
we
time?
honestly approached to ICJ by asking, was a declaration of independence, unilateral declaration of independence in accordance with international law? We got an answer. Well, that was answer. A very interesting answer. But even though many people has been interpreting that answer in accordance with their interests, we kept Serbia on the calm and diplomatic way. And that was very important strategically thinking. Even though in that time, current government's parties has been the strong opponent on keeping Serbia on that track. But in the meantime, we created national consensus on pro-European integrations, which means to solve peacefully Kosovo issue. That was very important strategical decision. Now, we have a new stage, and every single day, tomorrow we'll have a new stage. And that is why, and after tomorrow, a new stage in that process. And that is why I think it's very important to have a wider perspective and strategical orientation of my country to become member state of European Union. That we can only solve our historical challenges by using peaceful, calm, and diplomatic solutions. All other solutions are bringing all of us, not only Serbs, but all regional countries, in a very difficult, unsustainable situation. That is how I see that process in which the ICJ opinion was one of the cornerstone.
It's unfortunately, that's a perfect note on which to end. There's a lot more to say, but I think I would just say in conclusion, I think the real triumph of a governing party is not that it remains in government forever, but that it converts the opposition to its policies. And that has been the real revolution in Serbia, to which President Tadič deserves all credit.